Alrighty, well, officially, hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde, and welcome to Character, as much an external thing as a tree or rock. I'll pass it over to Nathan Brown to introduce our speaker in just a moment, but first we'd like to help situate you. So we are streaming live from Concordia University's fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke in Montreal. If you're here with us for the first time or on Zoom or in person, welcome. We're so glad that you can make it today. At Fourth Space, we collaborate with our university community to activate the diverse research projects and initiatives and development across the university at any one time by co-creating daily activities. So it's our pleasure to be able to facilitate this moment for you today. Folks, if we will have a time for a Q&A, I'll just signal that those of you who are in the space, just raise a hand and we'll get a handheld microphone to you so that we can hear you on the live stream and in Zoom. And if you're joining us via Zoom and have a question, you're more than welcome to use the chat or raise a virtual hand and unmute yourself. Okay, without further delay now, I'll pass it over to Nathan. Hi there.
Hi there. Okay, thanks so much, Anna, and thanks to everyone for coming this afternoon. I'm Nathan Brown. I'm the director of the Center for Expanded Poetics at Concordia and a professor of English. And I'll just say this is the first time that the CEP has hosted an event here in Fourth Space, and it's a really great context. I'm really grateful for your help in putting this event together. It's a real pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Pearl Brilmyer, who is assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is also core faculty in the programs in comparative literature and women's and gender studies. Pearl is the author of The Science of Character, Human Objecthood, and the Ends of Victorian Realism, published by University of Chicago Press in 2022. And that's going to be the focus of her talk today. She's also the co-editor of two special issues. So one in GLQ, Gay and Lesbian Quarterly, on the topic of the ontology of the couple. And I really recommend the outstanding theoretical introduction that her and her co-editors wrote on that topic for that special issue. And also the editor of a special issue of the Journal of Psychoanalysis and History on Lou Andreas-Salomé's 1916 essay titled Anal and Sexual, which features the first English translation of that essay. So I would just point out that in addition to her work on science and literature and Victorian fiction, Pearl is making really important contributions to queer theory as both an editor and a scholar and a theorist. And her next project, I understand, will be developing her work along those lines, a project that's tentatively titled Queer Rigidity. I just want to say a few words about Pearl's book, The Science of Character, before we get started. So let me just begin with a question from the introduction of the book. What might a literary history of character look like that did not trace the gradual movement inward toward the production of subjective interiority, but rather outward toward a still unfolding history of realist characterization centered on the appearance and motions of the body? So if that's a central question of this book, Pearl brings to this question, I think, a rare combination of talents as a critic and a theorist. So first of all, an exacting attention to the historical development of debates in the sciences in the 19th century concerning evolutionary theory, the emergence of life, the distinction between organic and inorganic matter, and the constitution of human personhood. And Pearl joins this attention to that scientific context with a theoretically sophisticated historicism that's concerned with the development of the British novel in the late 19th century, not only examining theories of the novel and literary character, but also how the development of those theories was informed by the scientific questions that I've just mentioned. So there's kind of a mixture of attention to the history of science and to the history of the development of theories of the novel and the novel itself. And there's also a very close attention to the philosophical context in which those questions were pursued, kind of conceptual determinations available to thinking about those questions, particularly in what I think is an outstanding chapter on Schopenhauer and the so-called New Woman novelists of the late 19th century. So including figures like Sarah Grand, Mona Caird, Amy Levy, George Gissing, and others, including Hardy. So literary history, the history of science, philosophical concepts, and also an attunement to the development of theoretical debates in our contemporary context, all of these are brought together in a lucid and I think beautifully written argument concerning what we can learn about human personhood by thinking through the study of literary character. So really big questions about the value of literature. And in particular, how techniques of literary characterization in this period can help us to understand what George Eliot called the physics of character, which is the topic of Pearl's first chapter. So the way in which we're shaped not only as psychological subjects, but also as material beings, immersed in circumstances and events to which we're exposed right at the surface of our embodiment and our existence, as well as in the depths of our psyches. So Pearl's talk today along those lines is titled Character as Much an Exterior Thing as a Tree or a Rock. So help me to welcome Pearl Brilmyer to Concordia.
All right, everybody hear me okay? Thanks a lot, Nathan, for that really thoughtful introduction that does get at some of the core questions of this book. And it's really special to be here in person and be talking to people live about this physical thing that, came out in a period in which not many things were happening physically. It's also great to be able to have this event as hybrid and have people here online. So thanks everybody for showing up for this. I'm gonna talk about the book mostly and bring some context for the book, but I'm also gonna do some reading and some talking and give you a little bit from one of the chapters that Nathan mentioned on the New Woman novel, which is a big part of the core of the project. And as Nathan mentioned, this book, I didn't kind of come to it as a Victorianist. I came to it with these really big questions about what literature does and the kind of knowledge that we can get from fiction, and in particular, the realist novel. And I started, trying to think about what novels do. And I guess, I don't know if you have this issue here, but, I teach at a university where it's kind of more dominated by science and business. And so the undergrads that we get in our classes, sometimes there's this weird paradox where they think that literature is like a fun, creative activity that they could do on the side, and it's entertaining. While at the same time, not finding it any entertaining at all, they find it really difficult to read. And I guess I really sympathize with them in a certain way. I also find it really difficult, and I actually don't, I'm not someone who actually finds reading novels that much fun. That doesn't mean that I don't take pleasure in it, but I think, trying to understand what that pleasure is, which for me is really about thinking and trying to learn things about the world that these novels are describing obliquely through the production of imaginary figures and imaginary situations. So what is that knowledge? And as this, this started out as a dissertation and became focalized in a very particular time and place, which is essentially from around 1870 to 1920. Mostly in England, but including authors who are also South African or Irish, but coming through England at some point, and thinking about the kind of intellectual histories that they're drawing off of. And so I'm gonna kick it off by reading a bit from the introduction and then talking about one of the key concepts for the book, which is this idea of human objecthood that I'm getting from Victorian and then other German 19th century theorists of character. Okay, so in 1843, the English philosopher John Stuart Mill outlined a new science that he hoped would gain traction in the coming years. Let me see, how do I get my slides back? I don't know, I'm on the Zoom.
Let me help with that while you go ahead.
So in 1843, John Stuart Mill sort of postulates that there should be this new science. Oh yay, there we go. Which he calls ethology, or the science of character. This new field of research he proposes in his monumental contribution to the philosophy of science, A System of Logic, would, he proposes, investigate the forces, biological, environmental, and cultural, at work in the formation of character. Psychology, Mill proposes, should concern the universal principles concerning subjectivity in general. Ethology, on the other hand, would attend to the circumstantial and contingent processes through which particular personalities take shape. We employ the name psychology for the science of the elementary laws of mind. He writes, ethology will serve for the ulterior science, which determines the kind of character produced in conformity with those general laws by any set of circumstances. What causes one man's character to develop like this and another's to develop like that? What laws govern the transformation of subjectively experienced events, the unique sequence of which constitutes a life, into objective, observable traits, the unique combination of which constitutes a person's character? Now, any attempt to uncover character's laws would be forced to reckon, Mill thinks, with the contingencies introduced by circumstance, the watchword for the particular science of character Mill envisioned. The Greek ethos, of course, meaning not only character, but also habitat, milieu. Every individual is surrounded by circumstances, Mill continued, different from those of every other individual. Every nation or generation of mankind from every other nation or generation, and none of these differences are without their influence in forming a different type of character. Such a desire to account for the ever-pluralizing, ever-specifying force of circumstance placed Mill's science at odds with more essentializing sciences of character of the period, most notably physiognomy and phrenology, which held that character is inherent to and apparent in the body. In contrast to these characterological sciences, which interpreted the outward appearance of the body to reveal something about character's inner truth, ethology arose from Mill's conviction that the shape and appearance of the body is an unreliable source of information about character. Mill's attempt to make room for contingency in his science of the accretion of personal traits introduced a problem, however. How, if character forms always contingently in particular subjects in response to particular circumstances, could one produce a systematic science of character? Mill's vision for ethology was that it would become an exact science of human nature, as he puts it. Its truths, he wrote, are not like the empirical laws which depend on them, approximate generalizations, but real laws. But what laws could possibly follow from this ontology of the incident? A science that, in its obsession with the accidents of circumstance, seemed ill-equipped to outline anything so certain as a law. Even Mill, who at times expressed hope that adequate knowledge of circumstances might allow scientists to eventually, quote, positively predict the character that could be produced, end quote, even Mill wavered on the question of ethology's predictive power. Were the laws of character discovered, he admitted, quote, they should be hypothetical only and affirm tendencies, not facts. Ultimately, the tension at the heart of Mill's science between necessity and contingency, between universal or general rules and the circumstances of the particular case, proved too great to sustain. While a few English scientists attempted to implement Mill's ethological program, the attempt to establish ethology as a scientific discipline in England was by and large unsuccessful. As the 20th century turned, psychology, anthropology, and sociology, all also nascent disciplines in the 19th century, would become institutionalized fields of studies with distinct methodologies and objects. Ethology, or the science of character, on the other hand, remained unrealized, becoming, as one historian of science puts it, one of the many 19th century proposals that did not pass the test of history. So my book arises out of a kind of thought experiment turned proposition that although the science of character failed to cohere into a systematic disciplinary practice, It took hold implicitly in the work of novelists who used fiction to explore the dynamic material processes through which character is formed. I argue that although Mill's ethology failed in its promise to reveal how unique circumstantial experiences give rise to general and socially recognizable characterological forms, the novel, especially as it transformed in the hands of realist novelists at the turn of the 20th century, rose to that challenge, cultivating its own narrative science of human nature. What was this nature? To what extent could it be transformed? Such were, of course, the founding questions of the novel genre in general as it emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe to represent, in Bakhtin's words, man in the process of becoming. Especially in its early manifestation as the Bildungsroman, the realist novel was premised on the suggestion that character emerges relationally and contingently in response to circumstances. But where early Bildungsromaner often celebrated the ability of certain extraordinary individuals to transcend their circumstances through supreme moral strength, a new generation of realists would be far more uncompromising. Doubling down on the ethological proposition that character is determined by milieu, feminist realists of the turn of the 20th century would reinvent character as a circumstance, an irreversible sequence of events that engender a person unwillingly, unconsciously, and irrevocably. Bringing to life Mill's unrealized dream of ethology, they narrated how characterological traits and behaviors emerge and develop across a person's life, and how physical features, shapes, colors, gestures, take on social meaning through categories such as race, class, or sex. The literary figure that they used to do so was character, a term that, because it tracked across fields as various as natural history and ethics, metaphysics, and a nascent genetics, became the vehicle for the investigation of something beyond the pages of fiction. The elusive unity that renders a being distinct, an essence in transformation across space and time. So in this book, Human Forms, which came out recently, Ian Duncan, who's also a science and literary studies person, has argued that it was the perceived formlessness of the novel genre that rendered it, in his words, especially fit to model the changing form of man. In the final decades of the 19th century, though, the variable, fluid, and fleeting human form that Duncan identifies at the center of the realist project between the years of 1750 and 1880 would, in the latter part of the century, be increasingly gendered feminine. Her life marked by, in a phrase by George Eliot, inconsistency and formlessness. It was woman and not man, late century New Woman writers proposed, who was the ideal subject for the study of the determining effects of circumstance on the formation of character. To the dismay of many readers, both Victorian and contemporary, the new realism cultivated by New Woman authors throughout the 1880s and 90s would not showcase the individual's ability to overcome difficult circumstances. Rather, these authors often insisted that woman, to quote the novelist Sarah Grand, was foredoomed by every circumstance of her life. So if you've ever read a New Woman novel, they're not particularly cheery genre. They're all like doom and gloom, and they all have these kind of like incredibly tragic endings. And they've posed a kind of problem for feminist criticism, particularly in the kind of 90s and 2000s, because there's no imagined possibilities. Otherwise, there's no other world, there's no utopia forthcoming. And so in chapter 4 of the book, which I'm going to read from a little bit, which is about the question of the determination of women's character, I show how this emphasis in the New Woman novel and on the new realism, on the determinative role of the environment, points less to these women authors' affirmation of the kind of passivity of the feminine than what I read as their philosophical challenge to contemporaneous accounts of character as self-determined, such as that eventually given by Mill. So when I was talking about Mill earlier, I emphasized the extent to which Mill's science of ethology is premised on the assumption that character is radically open and determined by circumstance. Mill, of course, a founder of modern liberalism, would go on to alter or kind of edit this theory of character as being influenced by circumstance to eventually argue that we have incredible power over the transformation of our character because we can change our circumstances. So we change our circumstances, we can change our character, and therefore there's complete and total freedom over who we become. But in my chapter on the New Woman novel, I'm interested in how New Woman authors turn to a much more deterministic theory of the will, which they're getting from the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who I started to notice was coming up all the time in these New Woman novels, and I was intrigued by that correlation. So they are taking up Schopenhauer, I argue, to cultivate what I call an impulsive aesthetics, or a kind of new realism that's invested in the lack of agency that we have over the determination of character, highlighting the extent to which not just women's character, but all character is often determined by forces beyond our control. So one of the interesting innovations in Schopenhauer's 1818, 1819 magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, is that rather than drawing ontological distinctions between human subjects who are free and non-human objects which are determined, Schopenhauer approaches the concept of subject and object as two positions or perspectives through which a body can be experienced. And his theory is that when a body is experienced from the inside, it appears to us subjectively as will. So we feel that we're acting of our own accord because we're within ourselves. But when we experience a body from the outside, it's very apparent to us how much that body is determined. And he sort of sees that exterior experience of a body, whether human or non-human, as a kind of materialization of will into things like qualities that appear to us, like shape, color, or extension. So these are the kind of object qualities of any entity. So of this latter, more externalized experience, Schopenhauer writes that in the case of man, this is called character. In the case of a stone, it's called quality, but it is the same in both. So I became really intrigued and fascinated by this definition of character as the externalized experience of a body. And the more I started tracking and digging into Schopenhauer's English reception, the more I saw this theory cropping up, not just across all of the women writers who are referencing him, but also are all of the kind of translators of his early essays in England. But also the way, so I kind of make this argument that his English reception is all about materializing him. He's an idealist philosopher, but he has all of this interest in, he's trying to make his theory very compatible with scientific findings. And in England, where there's this much more empiricist, materialist tradition, they're reading him in this much more materialist way. So one of his closest readers is this physiological psychologist named James Sully, from whom the title of my talk derives. And in his 1871 essay, which is called The Aesthetics of Human Character, he writes, "The feelings of others being known to us only through external signs of his bodily movements and vocal sounds, every person appears to us as much an external thing as a tree or a rock." So Sully, as I said, is working out of the tradition of British empiricism. He's understanding our knowledge of character to be emerging primarily through our sensory perception. And, like many Victorians, Sully is like a scientist. He's also a literary critic, aesthetic theorist. He's working across all these different fields. And he's particularly interested in the way that literature has the ability to reproduce this externalized experience of character for us using language. So in his really influential 1874 study, Sensation and Intuition, he gets into how this is working in literature, and he looks to the realist novel in particular, the work of George Eliot, who he's friends with, and he proposes that in suggesting to the reader's mind an intricate series of visual and other impressions, such as those conveyed by a person's gesture, their carriage, their voice, and so on, fiction constructs what he calls transformed embodiments of character out of the sensuous medium of words. So Sully's claim that fiction reproduces in the mind of the reader the colors, shapes, and sounds of the object world might be met with suspicion in our contemporary moment, where we tend to think of reading as like a psychological activity, and all of these things is happening in the mind of a reader. So we might ask, aren't the sensations that are felt in reading imagined and thus entirely subjective? Why should we think of them as objective, as he calls it, deriving from a world beyond the subject? But I think we need to kind of, this is why I like working in the 19th century, kind of takes us out of our contemporary. We have to force ourselves to get out of the way that we currently think and try to understand how they were thinking about the experience of reading quite differently than we do. And we also, I think, need to reframe how we think of these words subjective and objective today, which we tend to use as descriptions of, we tend to use them in epistemology as theories of knowledge. So I want to talk about those two shifts. And the first is, the practice of reading the Victorian period. The Victorians really read with their senses. And this is a title of a book that I find really useful by David Coombs that came out relatively recently, where he points out that really far from a disembodied or solipsistic practice, reading was for the Victorians a perceptual experience that folds together the actual sensory presence of words on a page with the virtual presence of the objects to which those words refer. For many Victorians, as Ben Morgan observes in The Outward Mind, and he's talking about Sully as well as other materialist scientists from the period, the perception of character, whether real or fictional, takes place on the same register as the perception of physical objects. Likewise, for Sully, who's a key figure of mine, words on a page, properly arranged, indeed reproduce the aesthetic experience of a person in reality. And realist fiction is particularly adept at doing so, he implies, because it presents humans less as subjects and more as objects. It is staying, for the most part, on the exterior of the body, and is not, engaging to a huge extent with, say, free and direct discourse or the representation of subjectivity that happens in modernism. So, of course, this kind of objectifying tendency of realist fiction has long been a subject of controversy. You have Lukács's Narrator Describe, you have feminist critiques of the objectification of women in the realist novel from someone like Naomi Shore. And I find the Lukács one particularly interesting because, he's upset that, and he's more talking about French naturalism, he's talking about Zola, that realist description, he says, debases characters to the level of inanimate objects. But where Lukács could see in Marx's concept of objectification for Gegenständlichung only negative connotations, Marx, of course, himself elaborated a materialist ontology predicated actually on the ethical value of, as he puts it, allowing oneself to be an object. Man only creates or posits objects, the young Marx argues, because he is posited by objects, because at bottom he is nature. In making such a claim, Marx had built on the work of Ludwig von Feuerbach, whose commitment, as Feuerbach put it, only to realism, only to materialism, led him to proclaim, "I do not generate the object from thought, but thought from the object." From George Eliot's production, as some of you may know, of the very first English translation of Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity in 1854, to Olive Schreiner, 19th century South African novelist, literary engagement with Marx in a book that I talk about here, From Man to Man. All of the novelists that I'm interested in the book build on this philosophical materialist lineage, but materialism in so many different strains and senses, to question the notion that the subject is always consciousness or self-consciousness, by emphasizing this way in which humans are also objects, especially when they're being represented or perceived by other subjects. And they all are interested in the way that the novel can produce particular insight into this aspect of human existence. So I guess like a small caveat is that when I'm thinking about human objecthood, I'm not really interested in saying somehow that, and when I'm talking about how the realist novel helps us to think through this, I'm not really interested in saying that this is somehow outside of ideology, or that objectness is not kind of loaded with layers of perception or subjective representation. But I am kind of interested in taking the realist novel seriously in its attempt to represent reality in a way that I think has been foreclosed by certain ideas such as the reality effect, in which realism is always a kind of act of deception. So I'm interested in excavating from this archive of realists who are not like really the founders of realism, though I have 2 chapters on Eliot, but people who are taking off from Eliot and pushing realism to its extreme later in the century. And so in so doing, I'm interested in asking what fiction, precisely because it's not a scientific experiment with positivistic aspirations to objectivity and facticity, but rather because it is a historically and culturally mediated aesthetic phenomenon, what it might tell us about character that other modes of knowledge production cannot. And so rather than seeing the reality effect as a kind of act of deceit that sort of like gets us to believe that it's representing reality when it's really not doing so, I kind of approach the reality effect a little bit more straightforwardly, possibly naively, as an effect of reality, as a place where reality's textures, surfaces, and forms are, not unmediatedly, but are reflected and reproduced through language, as well as amplified by it. So there's a great book called The Economy of Character that my book is indebted to in some ways, in which the author Deidre Shauna Lynch argues that novel writing's claim to a singular distinction among the disciplines would be founded upon the promise that it was this type of writing that tendered the deepest and truest knowledge of character. This is a book more about the 18th century. And I'm arguing that as the 19th century came to an end, realist novelists in England took up this characterological project with renewed enthusiasm, extending its claims and testing its limits. But if the aspiration of the novel remained at the century's close to offer, to borrow a phrase from Ian Watt, a full and authentic report of human experience, the qualifications for this fullness and authenticity had changed completely. So there's a kind of literary historical aim of my project, which is kind of tracking how what a real character is changes, like the qualifications for that change. And I'm interested in how what scholars have long recognized as the hallmarks of 19th century realist character. These are individuality, interiority, psychological depth, capacity for intellectual and moral growth, what E.M. Forster calls roundness. How these qualities get replaced or refigured between the years of 1870 and 1920, with a much more materialist set of ideals, which each of the chapters of my book explore. So these qualities are instead plasticity, impressibility, spontaneity, impulsivity, relationality, and finally vitality. So there's a materialist turn in characterization that I track, but I think I'm not just interested in the historical shift, but what this historical shift then makes possible for the novel, how then the novel itself starts asking different questions about what the human is and how human character forms. So to give you a little example, in a chapter on the first chapter of the book that Nathan mentioned on Middlemarch, I track a kind of series of character descriptors in terms of plastic matter. This is the plasticity chapter, such as that in Middlemarch of Arthur Brooke as glutinously indefinite. He's a very good fellow, but pulpy. He will run into any mold, but he won't keep shape. Or Rosamund Vincy's persistence as that which enables a white, soft, living substance to make its way in spite of opposing rock. And, these are metaphors, of course, but Eliot is really weirdly consistent with, there's this whole layer of these descriptors. So I kind of pull all of them out and ask, what we can think about, like what theory is being developed here through this descriptive strategy. And I argue that these descriptors develop a vocabulary for the plasticity of character that, although certainly figural in nature, exceeds the metaphorical and its consistent explanation of characterological traits and behaviors with reference to physical laws. And so I track her engagement with the physical sciences. And this chapter, along with the second chapter, which is about this really weird Eliot text, this is the last thing she wrote, which is actually a collection of character sketches in the Theophrastan tradition. So it's called Impressions of Theophrastus Such. And these two chapters, my aim is to kind of nudge Eliot's studies, which has long been obsessed with the question of human sympathy and intersubjective exchange, and seeing that as the kind of hallmark of her model of characterization. So I'm interested in kind of nudging that focus to instead emphasize the way that Eliot describes humans as conditioned by bodily frameworks and habitual responses that allow them to sense some things and not others. And so from these two chapters, I track forward this materialist account of character from Eliot to show how throughout the 1880s and 90s and beyond, authors such as Thomas Hardy, Olive Schreiner, and Sarah Grand follow Eliot in emphasizing the role of physical encounters and bodily impulses in character formation, transforming character from the hidden kernel of an individual personality into a much more impersonal phenomenon that forms through corporeal interactions. In cultivating a more materialist approach to the human, I argue that these novelists would do more than just kind of revise what counts as a realist character. They entirely redraw the lines according to which reality itself was being partitioned in the late 19th century, insisting against the trend of what's happening on the power of the literary to offer insight into the workings of nature in addition to culture. So there's a kind of bifurcation of the humanities and the sciences that's happening in this period that we're all too familiar with today. You have someone like Matthew Arnold, or you have all these different defenses of literary study in an attempt to establish the field of literary studies in this moment. And a lot of those defenses, say Arnold's, come out of the idea that, okay, well, while the sciences describe the world as it is, and they're producing knowledge of physical reality, literature makes us better people. It teaches us, Arnold says, like how to live. And the authors that I'm working with are totally uninterested in that kind of defense, as I'm uninterested in that defense. Like, I think they've also proven that reading about some someone like doesn't make you like that group more, or doesn't actually give you more sympathy. But that is a sort of traditional defense sometimes of humanistic inquiry, that it makes us better people. But all of these novelists are kind of insisting that literature actually just describes reality, and that it doesn't have this like ethical dimension, which is intriguing. And so one of the essays that I find most interesting on this point is from 1891. It's written by Hardy. It's a short essay called The Science of Fiction. It's a little bit cryptic, but I'm going to read a little bit of what he says there. So he says, since art is science with an addition, and some science underlies all art, there is seemingly no paradox in using the phrase, the science of fiction. So this is one of, for me, a series of turn-of-the-century attempts to claim a kind of fundamental stratum of material reality for literature at a time when this reality is increasingly being thought to be the province of the sciences. Positioning fiction as an authority on character and character as a key to reality, Hardy's essay insists that literature does more than illustrate social or moral principles. It produces, as he puts it, comprehensive and accurate knowledge of realities. Through close attention to the complexities of human perception and experience, fiction, Hardy indicates, generates such a precise and vivid account of the real. The particulars of this science, he writes, are the generals of almost all others. The materials of fiction being human nature and circumstances, the science thereof might be dignified by calling it the codified law of things as they really are. So what does it mean to say that literature produces knowledge of reality, and that character in particular is the vehicle for this knowledge production? So one person whose work I found really useful for understanding how this might work is Catherine Gallagher, who has quite a few pieces about what she calls the rise of fictionality. And her argument in how she's thinking about how we came to understand what fiction was as the novel was being invented was that the invention of fiction was actually less about an attempt to produce a fantasy world that's detached from the world that we live in than a really complex reorganization of the semiotic relationship between literary persona and the real kinds of people they were thought to represent out there in the world. And she argues that early novelists, interestingly, in attempting to avoid all the libel charges that were being brought to them, which were saying like, this character is clearly representing this person, and they were sort of trying to argue that no, it's fiction, and those arguments in her reading like actually produce a theory of what fiction and fictional characters are doing. So they insist that their characters are specific people that don't reference specific people, they reference types of people that exist out there in the world. And so what's real is the type, and what's fictional is the particular character in the fiction. So they understand themselves to have deduced their fictional characters from abstract ideational types, which they have in turn induced from real and particular individuals. In so doing, Gallagher argues, quote, they inverted normal empirical ways of thinking about the relation between the real and the imaginary, the sensual or experiential on the one hand, and the ideational on the other. So Gallagher's quite historically situated account of how early novelists came to understand themselves as producing knowledge about humans in general by referring to nobody in particular undergirds a key philosophical premise of my book, that the realist novel engages in these practices of induction and deduction in ways that empirical and rational sciences do not. While I examine the work of a much later generation of novelists than Gallagher, I'm not so much though tracking her argument forward in time as I'm interested in pushing it logically one step further. Within the paradigm of realism that the science of character elucidates, Fictional characters are understood not merely as representatives of types, but rather as ciphers for the theorization of character as such. I believe this is what Hardy meant when, in aligning his work with the new realism that had emerged in recent years, he wrote, as I said before, but it's kind of worth repeating this interesting quote, "The particulars of this science are the generals of almost all others. The materials of fiction being human nature and circumstances, the science thereof might be dignified by calling it the codified law of things as they really are." So in closing, rather than kind of like keep zooming out and give you the bigger claims as I've been doing, I want to kind of zoom in and do like just a little close reading that happens in one of the chapters about this new realism, as I've been calling it, which emerged throughout the 1880s and 90s. It really emerges in the hands of women novelists, though it's sometimes overly associated with male novelists like Gissing or Hardy. And it's really deeply engaged with the natural and physical sciences, and it's influenced by French naturalism, but it's quite distinct from it in a lot of ways. And critics, particularly male critics, are very like disturbed by it. So one critic is saying like, now every literary lady is realistic, and everyone says how clever, how charming. And I'm going to talk about how, so in 1895, the English critic Arthur Waugh, this is a particularly amazing and funny essay, where he characterizes this new school of realism that is emerging in the hands of women as surgical, complaining that new women authors, in reducing the human to its body and physical functions, had generated a model of character whose analysis may be of value to science, he says, but it's absolutely foreign to art. So while the most characteristic literature of the time has been introspective, Waugh observes, the newest trend in realist fiction in England has been to turn away from the mind toward a discussion of the passions and the sensations. It is this new development, it is in this development that the new school of realism has gone furthest, he remarks, before coming to his point, which is that in contrast to the old realism, which had cultivated a more cerebral and objective approach to reality, the new realism suffers from a troubling want of restraint, he says. That women writers are chiefly to blame for this new unrestrained realism explains for Waugh not only its thematic concern with the body and its impulses, but the lack of control exercised in its characterizations themselves, which, in allowing subjective feeling to distort objective perception, have become, as he puts it, passion's slave. Alluding to Sarah Grand's new woman novel, The Heavenly Twins, which had scandalized readers with its detailed depictions of pregnancy and venereal disease, Waugh writes, and that's the quote up here, "There is all the difference in the world between drawing life as we find it, sternly and relentlessly, surveying it all the while from the outside with the calm, unflinching gaze of criticism, and on the other hand, yielding ourselves to the warmth and color of its excesses, losing our judgment in the ecstasies of the joy of life, becoming, in a word, effeminate." So critiquing the new realism on the grounds on which it was founded, verisimilitude, Waugh concludes that the female realist is doomed to failure unless she, quote, throws off the habit of her sex and learns to rely upon her judgment and not her senses. Waugh's comments reveal the extent to which English readers were concerned that realism had been feminized when women writers entered the literary marketplace en masse and began cultivating their own distinct brand of realist aesthetics. The new realism that emerged in the hands of new woman novelists at the turn of the century was founded upon a claim to a new intimacy with physical reality, an intimacy that critics such as Waugh intimated risked collapsing the distinction between art and life. With women holding the pen, the supposedly distanced and cerebral perspectives of the old realism had given way to the subjective and all too immediate sensations of the new. 1 year after Waugh's complaint that women realists were failing to paint reality with the appropriate restraint, the critic James Ashcroft Noble attacked the new realism on similar grounds, contending that its representation of human life was skewed by an erotomania that unnaturally isolates one aspect of life over the rest. So like Waugh, Noble suggests in his essay that the thematic focus on sexuality in this literature has led to a crisis of representation. The implied thesis of these new novels, according to Noble, is that, quote, sexual passion is the mainspring of human agency. And he argues that it's a flagrant violation of the obvious proportion of life. The new fiction of sexuality, he writes, presents to us a series of pictures painted from reflections in convex mirrors. The colossal nose, which dominates the face, being represented by one colossal appetite, which dominates life. So recalling Stendhal's maxim, the novel is a mirror being carried along a road, Noble's suggestion that the new realist novel overstates the centrality of subjectivity to subjectivity and agency in the same way that a bad painter might overemphasize a nose, submits realist characterization to the test of proportion that founded novelistic character in the first place. Lynch has suggested that throughout the 18th century, the distinction between character and caricature became increasingly crucial as the novel worked to validate and naturalize a conception of character as representational. As the novel emerged as a genre, she suggests excesses of caricature were gradually devalued in favor of an aesthetic style that carefully controlled the number of strokes necessary to render a character realistic. These debates continued well into the 1890s, obviously, where critics like Noble and Waugh attacked the lack of proportion that they saw at work in new realist representations of character as driven by women's unbridled desire. And they often insisted that these new women novelists were insisting that their novels, however, in fact, were truer to reality because they were, giving voice to this repressed instinct that hadn't been given space in earlier fictional representations. So a powerful example that I'm going to close with is Grand's novel, The Heavenly Twins, one of the main targets of Waugh's attack. Particularly throughout the novel's fourth chapter, Grand cultivates a kind of unique style of characterization that strips characters of their identifying features in order to highlight how character forms through impersonal corporeal interaction. This chapter, called The Tenor and the Boy, an interlude, breaks the larger narrative of the novel to document a brief yet consequential interaction between two characters referred throughout the chapter, largely by these generic names, the tenor and the boy. Well, the tenor's real name is eventually and entirely inconsequentially revealed to be Julian Van Temple Esquire. The boy's name is at the chapter's end, much more dramatically revealed to be Angelica Hamilton Wells. A young woman who's disguised herself as her twin brother, Angelica is said to have concocted this gender-bending plan to forge a relationship with a man outside of the pressures of courtship and marriage. The Tenor and the Boy narrates not only how Angelica becomes an object of desire for the tenor, but how through her transformation into the boy, Angelica experiences, as she puts it, an awakening in which I recognize myself. In her depiction of the boy, Grant emphasizes not so much how the individual Angelica transitions into boyhood, but the characterological change undergone by the boy as the result of his encounter with the tenor. Grant presents this transformation not so much as a willful act of self-creation, but a reaction formation in response to the enjoyably objectifying gaze of the tenor. It was delightful to look at myself, an ideal self, from afar with your eyes, says the boy. Mentally and morally, I was exactly what you thought me. The boy also enjoys objectifying the tenor. It is curious, he broke off, gazing at the tenor critically, that Angelica should specifically admire your chin. It is your mouth that appeals to me. I should think that you're the sort of fellow that women would like to kiss. So in addition to the novel's progressive representation of gender, which lends itself to both feminist and trans-affirmative readings, what's particularly innovative about this chapter is its strategy of characterization. Forgoing almost entirely the use of proper names, the chapter relies on descriptions of bodies and movements, as well as dialogue, to lend consistency and specificity to the characters of its characters. A dialogue between the tenor and the boy hints at the effect of this descriptive strategy. Quote, "I never thought of your having a name," remarks the tenor, to which the boy responds, "Do you mean to say that you think of me as such a non-entity?" "Just the opposite," the tenor replies. "Your individuality is so strongly marked that you don't seem to require to be labeled like other people. By the way, what is your name?" Grand's strategy of characterization functions similarly. Not only is the intensity of the tenor and the boy's interaction presented as emerging in and through the impersonality of their relation and their mutual objectification of each other, but Grand's detailed descriptions of her characters' bodies and movement seem almost to obviate their need for proper names. Their individuality being so strongly marked in and through the depiction of their gestures, tics, and other qualities, that Angelica and David are nothing more than distractions for comprehending the logic of feeling that governs their interaction. Indeed, as the chapter's conclusion seems to imply, dismissing entirely the significance of its big reveal, even the signifier boy, while certainly a useful category for obtaining social privileges, is not a very helpful description of a person's character. Quote, "It was only a change of idea, really. The boy was a girl, and that was all." Thanks.
Thanks so much. It was a great talk. So I guess we have time for questions, and I guess I can moderate the Q&A. Can we also, is it possible to take, just looking for the fourth space people, can we also take questions from, yeah?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, great.
Anyone at all in the space have a question? Any questions? Perfect.
Yeah, Jonathan. Oh, there's a mic, I guess.
Sorry.
Can everybody hear me now? Okay, thanks, Nathan, and thanks, Pearl, for that really generous and widely ranging talk. I had just a very short question that's really more of an invitation to think about some of the literary critical stakes of what you're doing, and that would be, so if I understand your argument, you're suggesting that what's happening in the novel in the later 19th century into the early 20th century is a movement away from individual character and towards a kind of materialism as a way of understanding, individual psychology, and towards a kind of materialism as a way of understanding character. And I guess my question would be, why have other critics missed this? Why are other critics so keen on talking so persistently about individual psychology and the inner qualities of novels and novel reading?
Thanks, yeah. That's a big question for me too, and the coda of the book really gets into that through some of like the more literary critical genealogies. But I mean, I think one like very simple reason is that why they've missed it is that the New Woman novel has not been part of that genealogy. So you kind of like you'll see like, I don't know, take like Auerbach's Mimesis, or any like kind of study that really tracks like realist character across like a long period. You'll kind of see it go from people like, I mean, like in the 19th century, Dickens, or like Balzac, if you're in the French tradition. And then it kind of will like maybe talk about French naturalism a bit, which does kind of map on and is part of this story in some way. But then it eventually moves into this gradual interiorization of character and end with someone like Woolf or Joyce. And I just think the New Woman novel has not been a part of that literary lineage. And so that's one reason why that it's sort of just like a gendered answer to that question as to why this has been imperceptible. I also think it's because there's a kind of elision of like through, I think, Forster in particular, in creating this category of roundness and opposing it to flatness, he's like jumbling a bunch of things into that category. And it helps when we disarticulate like a lot of those things, which are, you know, not only individuality, but psychological depth, ability to grow and change. If we start like pulling apart some of those things, we can see how, say, the late Victorian novel is still very interested in temporality and how character changes over time. But it is, you know, because of like the influx and all the, you know, of evolutionary theory and the, you know, emergence of physiological psychology and the importation of, say, like German physiological science, like people like Helmholtz and things into the British context. Because of all those shifts, there is this intense materialization of thinking about subjectivity in very materialist terms. And so, you know, really the impetus of the book is like trying to recover that moment and seeing how, like, one weird thing that I figured out is that that I talk about in the coda is that Forster, when he writes aspects of the novel where there's like this distinction, which for him is a conceptual distinction between flat and round. He doesn't really historicize it that much, but people after him will be like, we started off with flat characters and then they got increasingly more round and the roundness just keeps going. And then we get more and more interiorized. And I think what's weird is like he actually gets that distinction from George Eliot's part, I think. He like cribs it from this essay by George Henry Lewis, who's a physiological psychologist / theater critic that's George Eliot's longtime partner. And what's interesting is that Lewis is framing things quite differently than him. And so my kind of question is like, what if we looked at Lewis rather than Forster as theorizing this kind of distinction? And Lewis's question is not how do we produce a character that seems real because they're psychologically complex, but how do we produce a character that seems alive? And so when we think about something like vitality, that rather than psychological depth as a category that the late Victorians were interested in, all these other things start like appearing, I think, and allow us to notice things that had kind of flown under the radar in our literary histories.
I could pose a question also if nobody wants to jump in right away. This would take us back to the questions you were raising about the reality effect of fiction and the construction of character, and the claim that the Victorians were reading in a very sensory way, having a sort of direct experience of sensory qualities or properties of characters, et cetera. And I guess so just some thoughts about that. I mean, when I was listening to the argument, it seemed like there's a little bit of resistance to kind of like rhetorical reading and emphasis on the mediation of language and an attempt to think about this more direct presentation of character as though you were having an immediate sensory experience of another person. But I wondered if that's entirely necessary or if, you know, attending really closely also to the rhetorical substrate of language, which I also think you're doing in the book, is really important, because just in the example that you gave, okay, so like a character is described as pulpy or glutinously indefinite. So what strikes me about that is, a couple things. First of all, Like if we experience someone and we, like, let's say we came up with the description of them to someone else. So this person is pulpy and glutinously indefinite. I mean, first of all, it's very hard to imagine what one means, like in a way that isn't quite vague. And secondly, I would say like these are figures which are, it's quasi-scientific language, a word like glutinously. And it also almost describes like wet paper. So it has a kind of almost reflexive dimension of thinking about the materiality of the medium, so that there's this rhetorical virtuosity going on in a description like that, which in any direct experience of a person would be kind of like half unconscious. We wouldn't determinately articulate that sort of thing to ourselves. And if we did, it might be taken as a sort of exhibition of, you know, rhetorical fluency. Or, so then I wonder if like actually it's just very important that these novelists are using scientific language, are using scientific figures, are bringing in a sort of discursive apparatus from their reading and from the concerns of the day that then is active in the rhetorical figures of the text. And I guess so the question that strikes me is, aren't we sort of, it's not just that if someone is glutinously indefinite, we might imagine such a person, but it seems to me like something that we're also like conceptualizing, that the concept is just as important as any imagined sensory, you know, experience that we might have. So what's going on with literary language, let's say at the crux of concept and sensation, you know, rendered through figures? I just wanted to return to that problem.
That's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I've been researching more. I'm working on this piece about metaphor, and I've been trying to figure out what the Victorian, how they understood metaphor to work. And there's all these kind of debates about whether there's, like, in the 18th and 19th century, for the first time, you have a kind of real serious philosophical interrogation of the distinction between literal and metaphorical language, or like the literal and the figural, where since Aristotle, there's this kind of assumption that metaphors deviate from the literal, or like that metaphors are ornamental and they use language by sort of like taking a word from one context and transferring it to this other area. But that they start realizing like, oh, even things that we think are literal descriptors are actually like what now we call like dead metaphors or whatever. They started as metaphors and then we've forgotten that they're metaphors and we just use them. So it becomes harder to distinguish between those two things. And I'm bringing this up because I think that, say, those character descriptions, there's a lot of, I do think there's not a dismissive, you know, I don't have any interest in dismissing rhetorical reading as such. Where I think we lose things is like when we say, okay, like saying that Brooke is glutinously indefinite is like a metaphorical way for talking about his personality. Like he's kind of like, he doesn't have like a good character. He's always kind of like a different person in different contexts, kind of like wishy-washy. So we could read that as a description of an individual character. But then if you start noticing that there's this entire layer of descriptions that are all doing this, then I think we're forced to account for the way that these figures, and I have no interest in saying they're not figures or something, but the way that they're actually talking about, they're like building up a bigger theory. And that's where the conceptual does come in. So that it's not just about characterizing an individual or producing an individualized character, but it's about thinking about how figures both kind of like are a part of the production of like fiction, but also how they are always very tied to what, you know, whatever we mean by reality, or can put together a theory of how character as such is operating. And that's where maybe, I mean, you could say that maybe that's kind of more like metonymy or something, like where actually there's this real link to actual specific things in the world that these metaphors are affecting, and that there's not this gap. I guess what I'm resistant to is not rhetorical reading as such, but I guess a kind of like post-structuralist move that has asked us to like insist a little bit too much on the gap between words and things. And people like Eliot were reading, I'm learning now, like post this book, we're reading all of these theories about how language may have actually, arose out of like physical, like they're reading these kind of like evolutionary theories of language, and they're trying to understand how language is maybe not arbitrary in the way that we understand it today. Of course, it is in many ways, but they're really interested in how is language actually like emerging out of and interacting with the physical world. But it's still deeply conceptual thinking, and it just, I think, takes figuration even more seriously, like as we should be doing as like a way of thinking.
Yeah, that's great. Other questions? Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah. So just following up on your response there, I was wondering, to what extent is character in the much older sense of handwriting sort of still in play in the 19th century in these theories? Are they thinking about handwriting? Because character always had that older sense of it, it is a kind of an identifier. It sort of marks a particular person just by it's his character. Would be something you would find in Renaissance plays and used in that sense much more often than any kind of more recent acceptation of character.
Yeah, I talk about that in the chapter on impressions of Theophrastus Such, because Eliot, I think, is very much thinking about that older sense of character as the kind of its etymology is like an impression into a wax tablet. And that's where, we get the idea of like a word being a character, or like characters comprising a word. But that question, I think what's interesting is like that idea of impression, that one is like marked, that character is a mark, gets reframed when you start thinking about like associationist philosophy in the 18th century that then is still very important for someone like George Henry Lewis or these physiological psychologists. Sully is constantly talking about impressions. The Eliot's book is called Impressions of Theophrastus Such. And I think that the impressionist, the theory of impressionism, which is the kind of, our mind is a blank slate and we are like, it's a very more passive theory of the mind, that we are being kind of like assaulted, like we're being like assaulted and impressed upon by the physical world, is part of like this lineage of thinking of character as being marked, as opposed to the kind of like more Millian idea of our ability to kind of control and initiate that marking.
Other questions?
Somebody over there is in the corner.
Andre and then Bobby.
No, this is very, very fascinating. So thank you for coming on up to give the presentation. I'll try to be brief. I wanted to pick up on something you were saying that was coming out of the conversation already about the metaphor of metonymy, because the way you're presenting this plasticity is kind of inseparable from the idea of metonymy. In fact, the glutinous indefinite, of course, is a metonymic term entirely, since, of course, he eats bread.
Yeah. And it refers to protein, like of which a human is composed. Yeah, everything.
So I wanted to ask about both this kind of sense of plasticity, interaction, interrelation. I was thinking of earlier novels. You mentioned Hardy, like the Reddleman. So someone whose both his moral and his physical state coalesce at the level of the dye that impresses itself on his body, becomes a kind of literal character signature on his body. Emma Bovary's, rack of shoes that Charles falls in love with before he's even met Emma. All of these different contiguous items are operating. So on the one hand, you have this element that I think your talk is really beginning to illuminate for me, that relationship. But does it have any link then to the emerging sort of psychological category of empathy, to like Einfühlung, when it's coined the 19th century by a German psychologist, and whether there's any relevance here to your discourse of the novel and the category of empathy.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm obsessed with the Redelman, and I have a bunch of stuff on him in the book. This is a character in The Return of the Native whose skin is dyed red, and it's Hardy. I mean, there's this amazing essay by Elaine Scarry that's about how Hardy is always interested in how work becomes a kind of marking on the body. And so the Redelman is the total like metaphor for this, because he's peddling this red dye that the sheep farmers are using to literally see if their sheep have fucked or not. Like that's how it's used. You put the red dye, and then if the other one gets it on it, they're also red. So it's this like it's this mark of a sexual encounter, but it's also, what? Yeah, it is. It's still done as a practice. And anyway, I kind of read the Redelman as also a racialized figure, and I have this chapter that's about whiteness in the book, which is kind of thinks about how the plasticity stuff in Eliot and this kind of like plastic generic matter that everyone is made up of becomes when later in the century you start getting early like genetic theories of how genes transmit traits as this kind of like white or colorless ground upon which a racialized surface can be impressed, such that racial difference becomes weirdly on the surface, and underneath there's this kind of sameness of the human beneath. So I've been thinking a lot about the Redelman as like figuring these new paradigms of racial difference as they get aligned with skin color in the 19th century. But your other part of your question was about Einfühlung, and I don't talk about Vernon Lee in the book, but she's the one who, she's this late 19th century materialist, aesthetic theorist who is importing a lot of these German theories of sympathy from the sciences into the English context. And she's amazing because she is interested basically in, very much in line with how I was talking about how the Victorians think about reading as this sensory experience. Her idea is that, our experience of like the artwork is this like overwhelming, unconscious, bodily connection. And so she's like parading her girlfriend around to all of these museums and describing like how her girlfriend's body like reacts when she encounters like this neoclassical sculpture. And she thinks that there's this sort of like way in which bodies like physically respond to the artworks. And that for her is Einfühlung, right? And as opposed to sympathy, which is this more like cerebral, conscious, like I feel bad for you, I'm connecting with you on a human to human level. Einfühlung is this totally involuntary response that can actually, for all of these thinkers, track across human and non-human worlds. So you experience something aesthetic, like a mountain, and then you have like this feeling of like up. Lee talks about in this book of hers called The Ugly and the Beautiful. So I think, we've lost, a lot of people are recovering, I think, like the distinction that now doesn't really exist in English between sympathy and empathy. And I think you could use that word. It's a little bit later than what Eliot's doing. But I think if I'm seeing all these Eliot people as being interested in sympathy, which is a very and the kind of ethics that comes from like putting yourself in someone else's shoes. That's kind of a reading of Eliot. Like I think Eliot is more kind of interested in this like Einfühlung, like this kind of like way in which we involuntarily respond to both humans and non-humans. Oh, really?
Sympathy just, grants you seemingly a kind of a moral imprimatur for claiming this kind of recognition of an experience beyond your own. Like a man sympathizing with a woman in labor was one of the examples a psychologist was providing. Is that empathy?
Bobby, I think you had a question.
Hi, question from outside of Lit. Just wondering if you could speak to the connection that you're making between the account of the or the question of where or where not to locate the subject here or some kind of individual agent, and your interest in Salomé and the kind of psychoanalytic account of that.
Thanks. Yeah. It's sort of like, this is something I'm thinking about a lot right now as I'm trying to think about the second project, which is going to be have more psychoanalysis in it. And I often will be like, I do like some soul searching, like, why am I so into psychoanalysis when I'm also so into like, materiality and impersonality and the lack of like mind that is occurring in some of this fiction. But I do kind of see, I guess, of course, Freud is like reading Schopenhauer. And the centrality of like sexual desire to both Schopenhauer's philosophy, which I make the case that it's like extremely central to how he's thinking, to then these like New Woman novelists who are reading him, to then tracking forward to like I'm interested in Salomé as like another kind of like a woman figure in the history of philosophy and science who is not unknown, but is more known for like having sex with famous people than being like an interesting thinker in herself. And so I guess I'm really so Salomé is like in this essay that we translated last year called Anal and Sexual. It's a very like material theory of subject formation. It's very much about how the way that your parents, the way that parents treat an infant's body and say like ew about shit, actually like is central to the subject formation of that child. So I think of some of this stuff here as like a kind of like, for me, it's like in a line with the emergence of psychoanalysis. And I guess I'm thinking about Salomé and these other psychoanalytic thinkers in the early 20th century as trying to work out these problems about the way that the material experience of our body, particularly when we're not that conscious about it, say as an infant, becomes central to the formation of character. And I want to, it's like, it's not something I've done yet, but it's sort of like on my list to think about how this concept of character then has like these afterlives in the history of psychoanalysis. Of course, you have like the anal character, or you have all these different ways to typologize, thinking about different psychosexual disorders that do use that word. And the other person that I'm really interested in the history of psychoanalysis on this is Wilhelm Reich, who has this idea of character armor as that which we kind of like become like rigid over time. And we have all these like resistances, which I think is also like part of how Freud's thinking about the anal character, like these things that make it difficult for us to adapt and change and develop. So character there becomes, and this is where the new project is coming, like a kind of rigidity, like a kind of thing that you can't like get past. And there are certain, like Reich thinks like we need to like break this down in order to have like self-improvement. But there's a kind of question of like why should we maybe break things down that are maybe even working for someone, even if like it's perceived as dysfunctional by other people. So that's how I'm thinking about that tracking forward.
Omri.
Hi, thank you. I have a question that I guess follows up on some of the things that Nathan was pressing you on. But I, can imagine a genealogy of character as it kind of migrates into the 20th century, working in a lot of different ways, a lot of different ways of historicizing character across time. So in ways that may be quite different from your own, but which also begin with a move away from subjectivity as the kind of mark or hallmark of character. But so I want to ask, in some basic way, how the science of character that you're relying on here is not merely some kind of intersection between a kind of sociological understanding of character as marked by circumstance, and then its kind of physiological entailments. Because we can think of a lot of different sciences of character as we move to the 20th century and even into the 21st century, if we want to really think about how to integrate current understandings of science backward. And of course, this is something that I think Ben Morgan does. So, so I guess another way of thinking, just to kind of concretize what I want to ask, has to do with different ways of seeing what is real that aren't really necessarily, on the surface or in sensation, but we could say, just like Catherine Gallagher in George Eliot, Imminent Victorian, I think that's the essay that you're kind of referring to there, imagines character as, or what is real about character as type. We could imagine what is real about character being, or what is real about character, or what is real in the world as discourse itself. What is real is the space, the social space marked out for discourse that people in their kind of interactions can create. So the reason why I asked that question is we can imagine a view of character that has ethical entailments that I think you're dismissing, where character is not either the heroic capacity to transcend circumstance nor the contingent incapacity to be anything other than one circumstance, but the capacity to work with, in an interactive way, with the rules and entailments of social life that has an external quality that is nonetheless character building. Do you follow what I'm saying here?
Are you kind of asking, I guess I'm not sure if you're asking about whether we should think of the novel itself as character building in the sense of teaching us things.
I'm suggesting that we might define reality in all sorts of ways, not all of which are exterior and sensory, but might be about the rules of social life, the rules of language, and that within that social interactive space in which we exteriorize ourselves or are part of this kind of determinate kind of discourse world, we could imagine character as a contingent process that involves agency, and that there's a kind of outward mind that involves more than just physiology and more than just circumstance, that extends backward into the 19th century, that George Eliot is interested in, and becomes incredibly important to modernist figures who, Woolf is not a novelist of interiority, or by one kind of model, she's a novelist of exteriority, in the sense that I'm trying to sketch out.
Yeah, I guess I'm not interested in dismissing, this isn't the only history of character. I think you could do a bunch of other histories of the concept, but I guess in taking my definition from Schopenhauer and Sully, I'm interested in what happens if we kind of isolate that term in this particular way. How does that shift our literary history when we define it in this particular way? So I think, you can certainly do a history of character that is more invested in and does show the way that I don't think is incompatible with what I'm saying. that sees character as more kind of like part of an engagement with social rules. But I do think that's the dominant way that it has been conceived. I think at least like from like the advent of like thinking of theories of social construction, like our idea of identity, which is our like more preferred word for character today or something. Like we are more interested in like personality, which is a more psychologized concept, or identity as a way of talking about, you know, what makes a person who they are. And I think that to me is the kind of more dominant framework for thinking about how humans become who they are, is through discourse and social construction. And I'm not interested in saying that that's stupid or that we shouldn't do that. But I do think when we only do that, these other elements get obscured. And I think that a different Eliot appears than the one that is invested in the power of discourse and social norms. When we just kind of set that aside, I'm not interested in like dismissing it.
Michael Snedeker, it's nice to see you. You joining us from Houston?
All the way from Houston, yeah.
Okay.
Pearl, thank you so much. It was a fabulous talk, and it's always a pleasure to hear you. My question goes back to one of your earlier comments about the question of fun versus pleasure when it comes to reading, because, and forgive me for returning to glutonousness, there's so many things to think about in your talk, but insofar as it focalizes, it seems maybe helpful. But one of the ways I think about Brooks' glutinous mindedness has to do with like the titillation that we feel in such moments, not least when something like his glutonousness is sort of bookended in the book by his leaky mindedness, how he moved from sort of the glutonousness of a bread lover to his leaky mindedness became, thanks to Bobby's question, a way of thinking about not just titillation, but a kind of, I don't know, a leakiness, insofar as these are moments not only in which a kind of substance seeps through the, say, a characterological form that a novel seems peculiarly unable to absorb, in the way, say, the glutonousness would have a different life in a text like a Dickinson poem. And so I guess I'm asking you to think about, or help me think about, these moments that seem like a kind of interestingly failed metabolism in the text itself that happens in these moments of characterization. To think about this in relation to the prior question, the glutonousness of Brooke would be this moment where interior and exterior are rendered sort of absolutely moot, which is to say character becomes most interesting or alive, to go back to that formulation, when characterology itself buckles against this other sort of substance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, and I think that I guess, yeah, the concept of plasticity I found helpful because it kind of mediates between a, say, like total leakiness or liquidity and a complete rigidity. It's about, you know, and I draw on, of course, Catherine Malibu's idea of plasticity, but it's also a 19th, you know, it's a 19th century term too. And so William James has this essay, The Laws of Habit, that is all about the plasticity of character. So this isn't like a modern, you know, imposition. This is, the Victorians were really thinking about this. And I think that, you know, there's a temptation, I guess, to sort of say like, oh, these characters are all kind of like leaking onto each other and there's no definition ultimately. But actually what is happening, say in that other passage where Rosamund's persistence is like a soft white substance making its way in spite of opposing rock, that there's like a way in which then these figures get mapped onto behavioral qualities and that kind of mutually inform each other, such that it's not that everyone's leaking everywhere, but that someone's behaving like a rock in this moment and someone's behaving like a liquid. And so there isn't, the distinction between interior and exterior is sometimes troubled, but it does it is like reformed also, such that there's a kind of mutually productive way in which Eliot's thinking about her characters are relationally produced, but I guess I don't think of it as like totally undoing all boundedness either. And I think the concept of, I talk about the concept of emergence in that chapter, which Eliot's partner, George Henry Lewis, who was a physiological psychologist, coined. And, you know, she, I think, is ultimately interested in, to go back to these kind of 19th century theories of reading, like, it's how, like, words on a page, like, which are discursive, kind of like can rearrange, you know, be ordered in such a way that then produces this idea in our minds of someone that is kind of particularized. Like, we do get a sense of Brooke's character at the same time that there's this language that is theorizing how character in general is operating through these interactions.
Thank you, Pearl.
Okay, well, maybe we should let Pearl off the hook at this point, unless there's any urgent questions. Before we do, though, I just have to say the books are for sale up at the front, $30, and you can buy it with your phone. We have this code here, a Venmo code. So partake of the opportunity to get the book without even having to wait for it to be shipped to your door. And let's all thank Pearl for a great talk and a great Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm seeing all the applause and the love on Zoom as well. Thanks, folks, for joining us in that virtual space. We're going to close up the Zoom and the live stream now. And for folks in the space, please enjoy. As a reminder, if you wanted to revisit this talk, it's on Concordia University's Fourth Space YouTube channel, already available now. Bye, everybody. Until next time.